Hello, my name is Antonella Sorace. I do research on bilingualism and language learning over the lifespan. And today I'm going to talk about language learning in children at a young age from a linguistic and a cognitive perspective. I'm going to use the terms bilingual and bilingualism in a broad sense to refer both to children who learn another language at school or at kindergarten and children who grow up with two languages, a majority language and either a community language introduced by migration or an indigenous minority language. I will show you that, first of all, we need to separate myths from facts, but also increasingly we need to separate science from science fiction, so misinterpretation of research. What are the old myths about child bilingualism and language learning? Well, one is that if a child is too young, they will get confused by two languages or more than one. And then increasingly, if they know more than one language, they may have problems at school. So again, this idea is related to the idea of confusion. What research shows is, in fact, exactly the opposite. There are positive effects of bilingualism intended as more than one language learned at different ages. First of all, there are benefits for understanding how language works. So a bilingual child can have a head start in certain aspects of early literacy because they have a better spontaneous understanding of how any language works. And that makes them better at learning other languages, but also potentially better at understanding the majority language, so the language of schooling, for example. Benefits of bilingualism and language learning have been found outside the language domain. So, for example, research has shown that a bilingual child has a better awareness that other people can have different perspectives, different points of view. And this comes from the fact that a bilingual child realizes that not everybody is bilingual, and so they have to choose the right language depending on who they're talking to. There are also benefits that have been found for selective attention or focused attention and the ability to handle conflicting information. This is something that we always have to do. No matter what we do, we have to pay attention in an effective and focused way. And bilingualism, having more than one language in the brain, has been found to enhance this ability to handle conflicting information, and that means also increased flexibility in task switching and adaptability to change. One important point to remember is that these benefits, these potential benefits, have been found in bilinguals no matter which languages they speak or learn. So what matters is the fact of having more than one language in the brain. From this point of view, there are no more useful or less useful languages. These benefits, these potential benefits, however, are not automatic. They are not always found in all bilingual children, in all language learners, because there are many factors that can play a role. Bilingualism is a continuum determined by variation in attitudes, quantity and type of input, level of engagement, and age-related learning mechanisms, as we'll see in a moment. You remember I mentioned science fiction. Well, some science fiction is the belief that children learn like sponges, so without any effort whatsoever. But also that language learning can turn your child into a genius. Language learning can make children more intelligent. Well, as we'll see, neither of these is a fact. It's more like science fiction. Let's have a look at language learning at school. So the science fiction that says that language learning in children is very easy because their brain is like a sponge. Is this the way it really works? What research actually shows is that younger is not necessarily better unless certain conditions are met. One is that a child should have enough input and exposure in a second language in order to learn it. They should also be engaged with the language. They should have been having fun and be motivated to learn it. And they should also hear the language from a variety of speakers. So hearing the language spoken in different ways, as naturally happens in everybody, that actually helps the child learn what is possible and what is not possible in the language. Are there difficult languages or more difficult languages for children? We can say that all languages are learnable by young children, but children don't learn like adults. They can rely on different cognitive mechanisms as they develop. So we should have realistic expectations about learning outcomes depending on children's ages. So how do children learn languages? If a child is young, they don't need formal language lessons. A young child doesn't have explicit learning abilities because their brain hasn't developed to the stage where they can actually use their explicit learning abilities. But they're very good at learning implicitly, so without realizing that they're learning, without explicit rules. They're also more enthusiastic about language learning. They can be really, really involved if we present them with engaging activities. So exposure and engagement are absolutely crucial for young children. Older children, on the other hand, have higher cognitive maturity. They're better at learning languages explicitly. They're still good at learning implicitly, but their explicit learning abilities get better. And also their attentional skills, their cognitive control develops and is better. So in order to understand how children learn languages and how much they can learn, we have to ask ourselves questions about input, for example, how much and what kind of input. For example, does input matter in the same way depending on age of onset of bilingualism, depending on the type of language structure that we're teaching, depending on social economic variables, depending on variation in the child's cognitive profile? And does the kind of input matter depending on where the child hears the language, so whether only at school or at home or at both places? How many speakers, as we saw before, provide input to the child? How many of these speakers are native speakers or proficient non-native speakers? And how many opportunities does the child have for engaging interactions in the language they're learning? If we take all these elements into account, it becomes clear that there are trade-offs between costs and benefits in early bilingual education, in early language learning in children, because the benefits are that language learning in young children relies on younger brains, it relies on their enthusiasm for fun new activities, it leaves more time ahead to develop proficiency over time, and it can really underpin the curriculum. So the advantages that we described are advantages for other aspects of the school curriculum outside language. On the other hand, language learning in young children requires much more exposure. As we said, the younger the child, the more input they need, and much more engagement. It requires good teacher training, so understanding how children learn languages at different ages. And it requires also good parental support, parents who know and encourage their child's language learning. Let's have a look at some research now on language learning in schools. I live and work in Edinburgh in Scotland, and we've been working with the Scottish Government on their policy to teach languages in schools, the so-called 1+2 approach, which means the native language or the first language plus 2 languages introduced at different ages in primary school. And the questions that we've been asking are essentially 2 questions. Are especially younger pupils getting enough input in the language they're learning? And are teachers actually getting properly trained on language learning at different ages? In Edinburgh, we have a public engagement centre called Bilingualism Matters, where we train volunteer students that are native speakers of Mandarin, Spanish, and French to go into primary school classrooms where these languages are taught and work with the teacher and provide native input and activities in their native languages. And then we do research on the outcomes of this project. One of the early projects concerned learning Chinese. Chinese is one of the desirable languages in Scottish schools, and we wanted to see how much children in primary 1, so children who are normally aged 5, can learn in some Scottish schools. And the questions we asked are the following. How much Chinese can children learn in different school settings, depending on various variables? Does exposure to Chinese have any effects on English? Remember the potential effects on the majority language. And are there any effects of learning Chinese outside language in the general cognitive domain? So we tested children in different schools, schools that were different with respect to the time allocated to learning Chinese. Some schools offered only 1 hour a week, other schools more than 1 hour a week. Some schools offered more student-led activities, so more opportunities to engage with native speaker volunteer students who could do activities in their language. And not surprisingly, perhaps, we found that children learned more Chinese in schools that offered more hours of input and also more exposure to native speaker-led input. So this is consistent with what we said before. Young children need more exposure, and also they benefit from hearing the language from different people. In another project, we explored the potential of multilingual classrooms, which are becoming a reality in many countries in the world. So we wanted to see how children from different language backgrounds in more or less multilingual classrooms learned a completely new language, a language that was new for everybody, and the effects that this language learning had both on English, the majority language, the language of schooling, and other cognitive tests. So we had a range of classrooms that had more multilinguals and less multilinguals. So more than 50% of multilinguals versus as little as 5% of multilinguals. The language that everybody learned over a year was Spanish. There were no native speakers of Spanish in the classroom. Spanish was a new language for everybody. What we found at the end was that a greater number of multilingual children passed the Spanish and the cognitive test compared to the monolingual Scottish children, despite the fact that many of these children were still learning English, actively learning English and developing their English language proficiency. But we also found a very interesting trend where the monolingual Scottish children performed better in these tests in more multilingual classrooms. So it seems that passive exposure to more languages in the classroom actually was beneficial from the point of view of learning a new language and benefiting from that language. These results clearly imply and confirm that maintaining the home language in migrant families is very important. Many migrant families often feel under pressure not to speak their home language because they believe that that is an obstacle to their child's linguistic and social integration in the new country. But in fact, maintaining the home language, not only is it not a disadvantage, but it can be a real advantage for children and for parents, for family communication, but also from the point of view of linguistic and cognitive benefits of maintaining active multilingualism. And bilingualism in regional minority languages or indigenous minority languages is also important and worth maintaining, not only from the point of view of linguistic diversity, which also means cultural diversity around the world, but also because they potentially can bring the benefits of bilingualism. These languages are under threat because they are often perceived as not being useful and interfering with the majority language, and also because they tend to compete with the desirability of English and other more prestigious languages. Attitudes are clearly important, so children's perspectives about the languages they're learning, their own being bilingual, are very important and should be taken into account. In a recent research project, we found that positive attitudes in children really matter. So we actually interviewed children. We talked to them at great length about their feelings, about their own being bilingual with particular languages. And we did this with Gaelic English bilingual children, but also children from migrant families. And we found that the more positive the attitudes that children had, the better they were likely to develop fluency in these languages, so bilingual fluency, but also show the potential cognitive benefits of bilingualism. That's why we think that we should really make children aware of the importance and benefits of bilingualism and language learning. So we increasingly talk to slightly older children in Saturday morning classes, in schools, in cultural institutes, about how good learning a language can be for their brain and how fun it can be. And children are usually very keen to know more and have lots of questions to ask. I'm coming to a conclusion here. What can we do to enhance language learning in children, in classrooms, in young people? I think first of all, we should provide accessible and accurate research-based information to parents, to learners, to teachers, to policymakers, not only about the benefits of bilingualism and language learning, but also about the challenges that are still there and the facts, the developmental facts of language learning and bilingualism, because information can lead to better decisions. And that's in fact what the center I founded 12 years ago, Bilingualism Matters, does. It brings research to people. It provides advice about language policies. It provides seminars and training for institutions and companies. We are often in the media about language learning and multilingualism. We have a wide international network of branches in 3 different continents, and we are at the moment spinning off as an independent social enterprise, which is still connected to the University of Edinburgh. And finally, this is information about how to reach us, how to get in touch with me, but also how to reach Bilingualism Matters as an information and public engagement center. Thank you very much, and I look forward to hearing more from you.